This playlist is going to collect together and organize the segments of the second lecture on Kantian ethical theory and on deontological approaches to ethics generally. As before, I'm going to organize the presentation based on the narrative that we see in this book that Kant published in 1785, the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, the foundation of the metaphysics of morals, which was sort of a dress rehearsal for his major ethical treatise, The Critique of Practical Reason. So the narrative isn't going to follow explicitly the Rachel's chapters. It's going to follow these Kant chapters. If you really want to read those, there's a link on the syllabus to a PDF copy of this book. It's pretty long, pretty difficult. Hopefully, this presentation will be much easier for you to follow, particularly after having read Rachel's. It's going to be more complicated than Rachel's outline of Kantian ethics. There'll be more things that I introduce, but I try only to introduce concepts and technical things and complicate the picture if it helps students to understand how Kant himself organized presented and defended his own ideas. And that's what I'm going to shoot for anyway. So I'll start off. Remember that his methodology in this chapter is going to be a methodology of synthesis. He's going to start off with the supreme moral principle, and then he's going to show how the supreme moral principle really organizes the domain that he's talking about, how things can be shown to follow from that categorical imperative. And I'll take a little bit of time to discuss a sort of wider worldview, re-emphasizing the intellectual background that influences Kant's thinking on this, give us a suggestion for how to understand the relationship between the physical world and the rational world. And then we'll turn to the treatment of the rational world, of practical reason that we have in this second chapter. So we'll talk about imperatives as laws of reason or commands of reason, expressions of practical necessity, and we'll make that distinction between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. Rachel's makes that distinction. I'm going to make a slightly more complicated distinction following the Kantian narrative here. I'll break hypothetical imperatives down to problematic hypothetical imperatives and assertoric hypothetical imperatives. I'll explain why it is that Kant makes that distinction, right? And then talk about why he rejects both problematic and hypothetical imperatives as the imperatives that give rise to the practical necessity that corresponds to morality, generates duty, acting from duty, and hence the goodwill, making actions morally valuable. So after talking about these two hypothetical imperatives, we'll talk about the categorical imperative. Rachel talks about that as well. And then we'll turn our attention to duty. Rachel's lots of intro texts talking about Kant really don't make a distinction between what Kant calls obligatory or perfect duties and meritorious or imperfect duties. I'm going to make that distinction as well. And the rationale for that is that in understanding how a imperative can give rise to a perfect duty, we understand one way in which reason can command using practical necessity. In understanding imperfect duties and how they differ from perfect duties, we'll understand the other. And it'll be the key to it will be understanding the universality of the claim. Finally, we'll end, as Kant ends his discussion, by talking about the will. We'll talk about Kant's notion that rational creatures exhibit autonomy, they're self-legislating, they are driven by, impelled by the practical necessity of reasons. So rational laws have normative force in an analogous way to physical laws having physical force, necessity. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about why he then criticizes other ethical theories as being based on heteronomy, being based on trying to get other things to control the will besides reason, and hence being bad ethical theories, but also theories that rob us of what's uniquely rational about us. So in that second chapter, gives a brief discussion of how the supreme moral maxim, the categorical imperative that we talked about in the last lecture, isn't discovered empirically, isn't discovered by looking at actual instances of how people behave and so on. And in fact, any attempt to do that would be bad. Instead, he says it's discovered through reason independent of experience, i.e. through rational reflection. And then he goes on to kind of frame the background for this chapter, really talk about the project that's going on in this chapter. So he tells us that everything in nature works in accordance with laws. Only a rational being has the faculty to act in accordance with the representation of laws, i.e. in accordance with principles or a will. So Kant is going to have two realms of behavior that he wants to explain. And there's a nice analogy here between what Newton and Galileo did and what Kant's trying to do. So Newton and Galileo looked at terrestrial and celestial mechanics, right? How physics works out in the solar system and beyond, and how physics works here on Earth, and they tried to unify the treatment of mechanics so that all mechanics was understood to come out of a set of exceptionless universal laws that expressed physical necessity. And the picture that emerges then is this unified treatment of all physical behavior under these laws. And these laws express necessity. They are universal. They have no exceptions. They operate in every part of space. They operate in every part of time, and so on. And as a result, the world is this deterministic place. So that we know the preconditions for a law, right? We know the arm length, and we know the angle that we pull back a pendulum. We can predict the periodicity of its swing deterministically. How the world unfolds is necessitated, and our laws allow us to predict that determinate necessitation. Now, Kant is at the sort of intellectual end of the European scientific revolution. So the European scientific revolution, it starts, oftentimes people will point to 1543, when Copernicus publishes On the Rotation of Heavenly Spheres, I believe is the name of the book, where he articulates a heliocentric model for the solar system. And that's where people often think the scientific revolution starts. Now, it's important to remember scientific revolution is really the European scientific revolution. It's really less of a revolution than a recovery. It begins by Europeans starting to reclaim and understand the culture, the mathematics, the science, the philosophy of Greece and Rome that was lost to them largely during the Middle Ages, and begin to build upon it. And so oftentimes scholars will say that the scientific revolution kind of ends roughly around the time that Galileo publishes his book, right, Dialogue Concerning Two Chief Systems of the World in 1623 or 32, sorry, dyslexia. And, that's a reasonable articulation of that. And we have to remember that only really a small number of people in Europe are engaged in this sort of scientific revolution, right? So you really basically count on your hands the number of people in any major European city who were doing this sort of stuff for most of the scientific revolution. And, you may have to take off your shoes and count on your toes to include the number of people who understood and were aware of what they were doing. It wasn't a pervasive social phenomenon. And at least in the early stages, it looks like a lot of it came from recovering ancient texts. A lot of it came because it was preserved and developed in the Islamic world during the Middle Ages. And hence, for instance, Copernicus, some of his diagrams look eerily like diagrams from Islamic scholars, even the labeling and so on. So the scientific revolution, recovering knowledge back into Europe from ancient Rome, Greece, recovering knowledge from Islamic scholars who developed mathematics, Hindu scholars, so on. And then they start to develop, build upon that basis. And so oftentimes people think of Newton's publication of the mathematical principles of natural philosophy in 1687 as a sort of the culmination, the fruition of what goes on in the scientific revolution, and it sort of triggers what's historians often call the Enlightenment, which was the period of time really of Kant's life. Oftentimes scholars will say, at least in France, the Enlightenment, again, around 1715, and it runs to roughly around 1789, something like that. Basically, it covers the 1800s, and the Enlightenment holds reason to be, the major source of knowledge, the way to characterize the nature of human beings. It emphasizes science and scientific methodology, political tolerance, constitutional governments, opposition to sovereign monarchical systems, civil liberties, right? So this is the time in which Kant grows up, right? Where the terrestrial and celestial mechanics that have been developing are integrated into one comprehensive and impressive system, where political, philosophical discourse is focusing increasingly on understanding human beings as rational creatures and trying to understand the nature of government and so on in terms of rationality. And Kant is by no means an exception to this. He's the epitome of an Enlightenment rationalist thinker. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next segment.